So good afternoon again. My name is Stephanie Kirk. I am the director of the Center for the Humanities, and I would like to welcome you to our annual faculty book celebration, one of the center's signature events in which we get to really celebrate the wonderful publications and projects produced by our humanities faculty over the last year or so. It's a time of celebration in which we can view the innovation and rigor with which our colleagues engage with humanistic research and writing. So today we have a full program. We'll begin with 2 short talks from faculty members whose work is featured in this room. I'll be shortly asking their department colleagues to introduce them. Then we will move to welcome our distinguished visitor, Professor Nancy Fraser. Professor Fraser's talk will be followed by a brief Q&A, and then I'd like to invite everyone to join us for reception outside this room. And I'd also like to welcome those of you who are viewing us remotely. It's wonderful to have you here as well. I'd like to also quickly mention a companion event that will take place tomorrow, a panel discussion with Professor Fraser and faculty colleagues Rachel Brown, Anka Pavlescu, and Isla Sharon, moderated by our own Talia Dan Cohen, Associate Director of the Center, with a title drawn from Professor Fraser's book, Are We Toast? Humanities Under Capitalism. This event will be held tomorrow from 1 to 2, 12 to 1, 12 to 1 tomorrow in the library. I think the RSVPs are full, but there is also still a Zoom option. So without further ado, I'd like to ask my colleague, Gerald Early, who is the Merle-Kling Professor of Modern Letters in the African and African American Studies Department, and for our purposes here, the first director of the Center for the Humanities, to come and introduce our first faculty speaker, Raven Maragh-Lloyd. Thank you, Gerald.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Gerald Early, and I teach in the African American Studies Department. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Raven Maragh-Lloyd. Raven is assistant professor in AFAS in Film and Media Studies. She has been at Washington University since 2021. She earned her PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Iowa in 2018, with an emphasis on Black life. She describes herself as, quote, a scholar of Black digital media. I approach the study of Black media and Black experiences through interdisciplinary techniques, through social science methods and humanities-based media history, unquote. She goes on to delineate her 3 primary areas of scholarly engagement. Quote, 1, Black online activism. 2, Black technological use and as media history and media history. And 3, global algorithmic cultures, unquote. This line of research has become increasingly critical in Black studies today in understanding how Black people shape their world and reality itself through digital means, and how the internet has made Black global life both more fluid and interconnected, while also ironically intensifying the sense of local geographies and the immediacy of place. This is not your grandfather's Black studies anymore, and Black experience with the digital has become as important as anything we might teach about W.E.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, Pan-Africanism, or Frantz Fanon. It is impossible to understand the rise of Black Lives Matter, or how a children's book like A Birthday Cake for George Washington was pulled from the shelves by Scholastic in 2016 without the kind of work that Professor Lloyd is doing. Her book, Black Network Resistance, Strategic Re-Articulations in the Digital Age, was published by the University of California Press in 2024. She is here today to talk about this work. We in AFAS are so proud of her. And this recognition that her work has received from her WashU colleagues, it is so very well deserved that the Center for the Humanities is offering this spotlight for her. And I am sure I speak for my colleagues in film and media studies as well. I wish to add as well that Raven is a wonderful colleague, warm, generous with her time, dedicated to the aims of the department. She is, without a doubt, the best DUS, African and African American Studies, has ever had. And we have had a few good ones over the years. All of us in AFAS feel privileged she is our colleague. Please welcome Raven Maragh-Lloyd.
How do I ever follow Dr. Early? Thank you, Gerald, for such a kind introduction. To Stephanie, Alicia, Kathleen, Talia, and the entire Center for Humanities, thank you so much for the honor of being here and for setting up this talk. To those visible and those we don't see, the people who set up the tables and chairs, who take down and make sure the space is clean and ready for our use, thank you very much. And of course, thank you to everyone for being here, and congratulations to my fellow colleagues on their incredible book accomplishments. In 2012, millions of people learned the name Trayvon Martin. After countless tragedies related to police and vigilante violence from Minneapolis, St. Louis, Louisville, and more, hashtag Black Lives Matter would reveal the reach of online activism, organizing, and political change. I'm gonna start my timer, sorry. At this time, I was writing and thinking about a different kind of reveal, that of the quiet space between the serious parts of the internet and the supposed flippant ones. The two instances, as I would come to study at length, existed side by side, defying expectations of online collective grief and sharply disproving any notion of a singular and ahistoric or trend-like relationship between Black publics and technologies more broadly. So Black networked resistance is about Black online users engaging in and creating digital practices that are often passed off as insignificant or unworthy of deeper inquiry. As a side note, the cover is from a WashU alum, artist Sam Motter, who got her master's from here. Through focus groups, media history, and critical discourse analyses, that meant taking seriously care and the ways Black women create what I call care networks as an impetus for more visible forms of activism online. It also meant taking seriously Karen memes as continuing legacies of historical Black humor meant to deliver doses of cutting truth wrapped in hilarious, in this case, memes. If you don't know, I teach a class on Karens, which is always fun. The book was also an opportunity for me to wrestle with this idea of resistance as overdetermined or saturated. The critique rightly goes that Black folks should and do exist and thrive beyond the oppression resistance binary, right? And while I agree that Black and other marginalized online users should be able, and indeed are, ratchet and sad and mad in our full humanity, the book was a way to historically work out how joy and resistance are indeed bound up together in unique ways online. For example, in one chapter, I analyze 4 Black users on Instagram who very intentionally marry the visual logics and mores of the platform with the aesthetics of everyday Blackness in order to demonstrate new ways of archiving Black history. From a Gen Z historian in Connecticut to historical interpreters in Atlanta and St. Louis, these historians all use the affordances of Instagram, namely its visual primacy, but also its intimacy and performance features to archive Black history in unique ways. I focus on these profiles given their reach across multiple networks. For example, one person is cited in Forbes magazine and the New York Times. Others work with local museums and schools in Atlanta, Washington, DC, and here in St. Louis. And still others integrate their Instagram profiles with their professional websites. What does it mean, this chapter asks, to use a contemporary site to tell stories of the past? How do we mix the past and the present to catapult, in this case, the story of Juneteenth to international recognition? And how are digital Black historians reimagining who has access and interest in the archive through use of digital media? Now, this is more than just young people posting interesting pictures to show Black history. Rather, through the case study of these 4 Black digital historians, I mount an argument here for a quiet reshuffling and reimagining of the archive. What I mean by that is there's a compression that's happening. Any digital people in the room, you'll get like ones and zeros compression, right? Compression that's happening of the past and the present through the interiority, expressiveness, and aesthetic expectations of the platform, such that users then see themselves intimately in and through the past as they create emancipatory mechanisms toward the future. The stories of these Black digital historians that these Black digital historians tell about Juneteenth are reworking broader narratives of freedom. And as we know, the stories we tell about ourselves as a nation drives the decisions we make. I'm working on a story now about Hillman Talk, if anyone's familiar with Hillman Talk. So who is deserving of state or federal aid, for example? What counts as legitimate knowledge in order to allocate said resources? You can take, for example, the notion of the welfare queen, right, and representations of Black women in the early to mid 20th century. And those representations as driving crucial decisions about state and federal funding to households in needs, loans, job prospects, and more. So examples like this abound across health, legal, and educational spaces. So when we make significant the humanity of Black folks online, we're driving our own narratives about who we are and what we're capable of. The everyday joy inherent in our daily uses of a seemingly flippant, certainly politically charged site like Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. We know Mark Zuckerberg is a whole other story of late, interrupts dominant notions of storytelling, access to the nation's story, and to its archives. Here again, resistance and joy collide. For humanists, these questions and approaches arise certainly out of our specific home training, but also out of our daily experiences, out of theory, and or certainly anywhere in between. What this project taught me, as I've had a short time to reflect on it, is to trust my instincts about the mundane. Oh, that's the mundane. Especially when my object of study, the digital, literally changes every day. A steadfast commitment to the underlying cultural currents of that object kept me afloat amidst onslaughts of flashy news headlines. The second observation from the book that I can draw to our audience of humanities experts here is the evolved relationship between the digital object of study and me, the researcher and person who learned to navigate adulthood in many ways via Black Twitter. This was interesting coming up with this talk because I had to go all the way back to my, to my Twitter account to see all the things I was tweeting in 2016. Writing about online communities also requires that you are part of these online networks. Black online networks specifically are hard to pin down for a myriad of reasons, so being a part of these cultural enclaves are almost necessary. My relationship to these digital communities and platforms as I got deeper into the research changed, however, in part because 10 years passed, I got older, and Black Twitter was now for the old heads, in part because of that, in part because frankly, Elon Musk bought Twitter and changed our appetites, and in part because my 5- and 2-year-old wouldn't let me pass time on TikTok in anybody's cultural enclave if I tried. My point here is that our relationships to our beloved objects and the subjects of study naturally are not static, but there also might be potential in tracing and paying attention to our evolutions in relation to the work as well. And third, I'll only point out the transition from Twitter to X in 2023, as it's had an enormous impact on researchers like myself in what scholars are calling the post-API world. Essentially, hashtags and conversations online are now harder for researchers to access and study. In some ways, as my colleagues who do work on data privacy might attest, it's a good thing for user data to be less accessible to the public, right? The problem, though, is that data becomes more obscure and privatized. The functions or algorithms that run sites like X are no longer the only black box, but the technology corporate landscape is ever more elusive and powerful, itself its own black box. Humanities scholars and people interested online, and humanities scholars interested in people online will have to navigate this post-API world in creative ways. So I'll end with this. As so much uncertainty surrounds the relationship between technology, politics, and our future democracy, what Black digital publics showcase is clear. The quiet, collective ways we engage and sustain each other are not only meaningful, but vital across any time period or media platform. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Raven. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Professor Daniel Bornstein, who will introduce our next speaker, Professor Peter Kastor. Daniel Bornstein is the Stella K. Darrow Professor of Catholic Studies and Interim Chair of the Department of History. Thanks.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be up here to announce and introduce somebody who is well known to many of you, Peter Kastor. Peter is the Samuel K. Eddy Professor in the Department of History and Associate Vice Dean of Research in Arts and Sciences. He is the author or editor of 8 books on the early American Republic. His research has been supported by organizations including the NEH, the ACLS, and most recently, the Taylor Geospatial Institute. In addition to his scholarly work, Peter has written for public venues, including the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, The Conversation, and Fortune. He regularly discusses the history of American politics on St. Louis Public Radio, where I've heard him. And earlier this afternoon, he finished recording one of several segments for the Napoleonic Wars podcast in the UK. He's an award-winning teacher, and 2 of his courses have been featured on C-SPAN's Lectures in History, so he is present across media. He has conducted professional and development programming for groups like the St. Louis School and the National Council on History Education, as well as various federal government agencies, which may still exist. Peter is also a capacious absorber of popular culture. When he was named the Samuel K. Eddy Professor, he made various allusions to Eddie Money, who I missed out on because I was living in Italy in the late 70s. So I missed my 2 tickets to Paradise, Peter. But it's not just his own generation's music. I have 2 nieces who can recite the entire lyrics of Hamilton, but Peter is the only professor I know who can do the same. This might be something that we would expect of an expert in early American history, but Peter also catches the reference if I allude to the useless and pointless knowledge generated by some universities. He would immediately know that I am alluding to Tombstone Blues. So, by Bob Dylan, for those of you who haven't seen the movie. It's not in the movie. He currently serves as chair of the Board of Trustees at the Missouri Historical Society. And most pertinent to today's event, Peter has spent years collecting and digitizing records for 37,000 people who worked for the federal government between 1789 and 1829. The results are very useful and pointed knowledge that are now publicly available via the Creating a Federal Government digital archive. Peter.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Raven, for turning on your watch because it reminded me to do the same. 10 minutes, right, Stephanie? We're off and running. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Sorry, Raven, I'm going to make yours go away. It's really a delight to be here, to see some very familiar faces, to meet some people I haven't met before. And I'm here to talk about a project that I was working on during a fellowship at the Humanities Center in 2021. But I really want to tell you about my first sojourn at the center. This was a while ago. Daniel, I'm very grateful you did not echo Gerald by saying when I got my PhD, it would make me feel very old. But I will say I was among the first class of fellows when Gerald ran the center in the spring of 2006. I was working on a book about William Clark of Lewis and Clark expedition fame. And it became increasingly clear to me that this was really a book about him within the federal apparatus. And I began to imagine that eventually, someday, I was going to write a book called How the Founders Governed. That was going to be a story about how the founding fathers created and really tried to construct the institutions of governance that they had designed through the Constitution. And then I thought, all right, well, how many folks were in that government? And I wasn't terribly surprised to find out that nobody knew. Nobody knew whether the federal government was large or small during the era of the founding fathers. And I thought, now there's a research project I can sink my teeth into. In the intervening years, there were some other things I worked on. I did 7 years, perhaps 7 years as department chair. I was going to say 7 years in purgatory as department chair. That's not about my department. I love my department, but all the current and former department chairs in this space know from whence I speak. So eventually I was delighted when I could get back to this project, which I show a screen capture here. It's on the computer there, which you'll be able to look at. And as Daniel said, this was a project that was designed to reconstruct the careers and really the experiences of almost 38,000 people who served as federal employees between 1789 and 1829. And coincidentally, like you, the preliminary version of this design was also by a WashU alum, Jamie Lee, who had just graduated from the Sam Fox School and really was able to bring my idea of how this should look into life. You're going to hear me do a lot of that because a lot of talking about digital projects is about giving credit where it's due to the collaborators that we have. So my goal for this project, as I said, was to reconstruct these careers, to do it in part through text. And there's actually a fair amount of text in this project that explains what I'd wanted to do in how the founders governed, to talk about what the federal system is, how it operated, how the founding fathers imagined it. But the crucial part for me was to tell the stories of these individual federal employees. So let's start with my guy, William Clark. So here's his record. You may know about him from the Lewis and Clark expedition. What you probably don't know is he spent over 35 years, almost 40 years, as a federal employee, as an Army officer, as the territorial governor here for almost a decade, and also as an Indian agent. Each record looks like this, shows the sources that the information came from. But the other thing is he's not the only William Clark. There are about 30 William Clarks, and they speak to the breadth of this experience. One's a commercial consul in Germany. One's a clerk in the War Department in Washington, D.C. One was a U.S. attorney in Kentucky, and a whole bunch of them were postmasters in the roughly 12,000 post offices that existed during this period. So in addition to this textual story where you could see any one of these folks and see their careers, I also wanted to tell this visually and spatially, which I did through this map. Here's where it starts, a map showing approximately, I think it's like 1,700 locations and land claimed by the United States and around the world. I got to travel vicariously. I was working in St. Louis, but I got to imagine myself with the US consul in Honolulu, or the consuls in Manila or Guangzhou. All of these places claimed by the United States, but not actually governed by the United States in certain cases. If you zoom in, here is actually not just, much of this is land claimed by the United States, some of it isn't. And then if you get to any one location, let's go to St. Louis, see what happens. You get to St. Louis, you hover over it, you click see who worked here, you get a list of all these characters, and then you can look at their careers. This also includes some visualization layers. I mentioned those postmasters. Many of them served in places that literally do not exist anymore. Some of them were in places called Jones's Store, and it's, you know, John Jones, it's his store. I don't know where that was. Or Smith's Ferry, it's a ferry across a river somewhere. So I represented it through this heat map of the postmasters who served. This is just from 1829. So that's my nerd speak. That's me revisiting this site, which has been such an absolute delight for me to build and a lot of fun to be part of. But now, like Raven, I want to take some time to stand back and talk about what this kind of work has come to mean to me and how it affects the way I think about the work we do as humanists. And so I want to talk about three things very quickly within my 10 minutes: collaboration, digital humanities, and public scholarship. First of all, collaboration. Put simply, I couldn't have done this project without the collaborative support I received, and especially the institutional support. So as I said, there are a lot of familiar faces here, some of whom, though, who worked on this project you may know, and some you may not. For example, this project began at the Humanities Digital Workshop, which came into being through Joe Lowenstein's vision and relentless hard work. And then at the HDW, with help from Doug Knox and Steve Pentecost, who really helped me build the data for this project. Many of us know Joe. Many of you probably don't know Ken Keller, even though he's tremendously important in all our lives. He runs Arts and Sciences IT. Yeah, Ken matters. Ken matters for this project because he supported the creation of an Arts and Sciences web team that's run by Marcia Billings, and they're the ones who actually put this on the web. They not only made it work, they make sure it works. And when it breaks, they fix it. So I'm tremendously grateful to them. And of course, there were just a whole host of research assistants who not only helped collect the data, but they gave me feedback on what to do with it. Undergraduates, graduate students, folks in the library all helped with this. And then, of course, technologists. And I want to emphasize something here. I'm trained in the humanities. So that means I don't play well with others by nature. That's not something we all necessarily know how to do. So when I talk about collaboration, the learning curve was mine. And one of the great delights of doing this kind of digital history is that for the first time, I really learned how to work on a team. And that was a source of tremendous satisfaction. That's part of what makes this kind of digital history so much fun to do. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm still working on that book, How the Founders Governed. I'm not sure whether I wish it was done now or not. I'll get to that in a moment. But when I presented an early version of this website at the center during my fellowship, one of the questions I got when I said I also wanted to do this book was, why do you need the book? You're building this. Now, my answer is partly because the book is going to do what the site doesn't. This is very much a bottom-up story of the federal employees. The book is going to be this more top-down story of the federal leadership, but that really wasn't all of it. Yeah, I wanted to write this book because that was partly about legitimacy and familiarity. I am of a different generation from you, even though we will not say when I got my PhD, except to say that I come from a book culture, and wrapping my head around the notion of being a humanities scholar who does work like this in the digital domain has been a hard step for me. And I say that in a room where there are some real DH people. You do that work, Raven. I see Matt Erlin here. I see folks who've done extraordinary scholarly production that is wholly digital. And working on this project, even though I worked on the first digital humanities project I worked on was when I was in graduate school over 30 years ago. Working on this really got me to think about this stuff. Finally, public scholarship. So I aim this for a public audience. I was talking with that Napoleonic Wars podcast today. It's not the only one. There are two Napoleonic Wars podcasts in the UK. I've worked with both of them. It's not like they fight each other. It's not like they're duking it out in the streets. They actually support each other. And that has been an absolute delight, but it's a challenge. How do I take the technical language of state capacity and state building and put it in terms that actual people can actually understand? That's been an enormous challenge and a tremendous area of excitement, and also something where I feel blessed to be in the right place at the right time, because WashU has gone all in on this stuff. The center has done extraordinary work to support public scholarship. Our colleague, Chris Shaberg, whose office is now in the provost's office, has supported many of us in learning how to make our work accessible to others. I emphasize that because it's really this critical moment for it. I think to a lot of us, we thought, oh, what we'll do is we'll do what we do and we'll make the general public interested in that. Well, we've tried that and it hasn't worked. Instead, we all need to work a lot harder at meeting people where they are. It's something where I know I still need to do a lot of work. It means challenging ourselves to think differently, to write differently, and to do it with humility and, appropriately enough, as humanists, to do it with humanity. In some cases like mine, it means I needed to change the media that I used. I also had to change the words that I choose, but that's also been a tremendously exciting part of this. It's what's made doing this project so much fun and so interesting for me. 10 minutes, Stephanie. I think I just about made it. Thank you all for being here. It's been delightful to speak to you today. Thank you for your comments, Raven, and I'm really looking forward to our keynote address. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raven and Peter. And now to our invited guest, Nancy Fraser is the Henry and Louise A. Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research and a member of the editorial committee of New Left Review. She's widely respected as a key critical thinker of our times and has produced groundbreaking philosophical work on justice, gender, and difference over the course of the last 3 decades. She's also a scholar of great global reputation. And as a Latin Americanist, I was so delighted to find out in preparing this bio that you have been cited 3 times by the justices of the Brazilian Supreme Court in opinions upholding marriage equality, affirmative action, and Afro-descendant collective land rights. She is also a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. She has lectured all over the world and has received 6 honorary doctorates, including from universities in Latin America and Europe, as well as multiple other awards. Professor Fraser's newest book is Cannibal Capitalism: How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It, published in 2022 by Verso. Cannibal Capitalism, which I read with some of my students last year, offers an expansive and incisive critique of capitalism that feels both sharp and now more painfully urgent than ever. It's an exceptional honor for all of us at the Center for the Humanities and the broader WashU community to welcome her here today. The title of her talk is Cannibal Capitalism, The View from Trump's America. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, you have it. Yes, just put it on.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I just want to thank Talia and Alicia and everybody else who's been part of organizing this event and hosting me. It's really impressive to walk around this room at this book display. I come from a very small and woefully underfunded institution, and boy, the riches that you have here in terms of intellect, scholarship, productivity, and love of the humanities. Really, really impressive. I'm jealous. So I also brought a timer, and I think I have 45 minutes. Is that give or take? Okay. So this book, Cannibal Capitalism, is a contribution to this interdisciplinary project called critical theory, and that's critical social theory as originating from the Frankfurt School, but no longer limited to that very specific left Hegelian orientation. I have often quoted the young Marx in trying to define what critical theory is. He once wrote in a letter, it's the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. That's probably as good a definition as any, but it immediately raises the question, what form should a critical theory with that aim take today in what I called in the title, the age of Trump's America? How should we envision the project of critique in a period of general, and I would say metastasizing crisis. That's a period in which multiple dysfunctions of our social system, our social organization are, as I say, metastasizing and sparking multiple forms, axes, and sites of social conflict. So these dysfunctions are not simply economic or simply ecological or simply social or simply political. It's somehow all of this, right, mashed up together and exacerbating different elements within this crisis complex. And in the same way, the forms and sites and axes of struggle span all of those sectoral concepts and overspill them in a way that's quite wild. That's a term I'm going to come back to. Some of those struggles are potentially emancipatory and others obviously decidedly not. And then there are plenty that are ambiguous and could go one way or another. Well, my book, Cannibal Capitalism, is an attempt to connect the dots to bring some kind of conceptual coherence and order to a situation which is frankly very disordered and disconnected. And so the book traces the roots of this crisis to the constitutive dynamics of our society, which I call cannibal capitalism. And in this way, I'm trying to integrate insights from Marxian thought, which I consider very much still relevant, not everything, but some. I want to integrate those still relevant insights with more recent paradigms of critical theorizing, such as feminism, anti-racism or critical race theory, anti-imperialism, ecological thought, and democratic theory, among others. And by bringing together, connecting those dots, so to speak, I want to try to say something about capitalism that hasn't been said, at least not in quite this way before, about its institutional structure, its crisis tendencies, and its grammars of social struggle. And in doing so, I want to somehow address the question or say something that could be relevant to the question, how in the age of Trump might participants in some of the struggles I'm going to talk about coalesce in a scaled up, using Gramscian language, counterhegemonic bloc, which has the heft and the vision to effect an emancipatory transformation of this hot mess that we are all living in. Well, as you can see, the concept of crisis is central to this project. And I have to say that in centering that concept, I am restoring it to a central place that it used to hold in the tradition of critical social theory, but out of which you could say it's been shoved in recent years. You may recall that crisis thinking was not so long ago rejected as necessarily constitutively economistic, deterministic, teleological, mechanistic, et cetera, et cetera. And yet here we are. We can't do without this concept. And we have to rethink what it means to do not just an injustice critique, but what we could call an irrationality critique of the society, the way that it is, by virtue of its own inherent internal dynamics, always involved in self-destabilization. That's what I mean by irrationality. Okay, so as that point already indicates, I'm using the term crisis in a technical sense. I don't just mean a collection of bad stuff that happens accidentally, randomly, and which different bads are, more or less separate or isolated from one another. Crisis here means, and this really does come from Marx, the effects of a social system that is inherently prone to self-destabilization by virtue of its constitutive dynamics. So it is a crisis here then is not a laundry list of looming threats and realized miseries, even though there are lots of those and they are very real. I could mention crushing debt, precarious work, besieged livelihoods, dwindling services, crumbling infrastructure, hardened borders, racialized violence, deadly pandemics, extreme weather, ongoing genocide and hot war, and of course, all the myriad political dysfunctions that overarch all of that and block our ability to envision and implement solutions to any of those other things. Those are all bad, for sure. But my claim is that they're all traceable to one and the same social system that generates them non-accidentally, and in that way is in living out its signature self-destabilizing process. And I call that system cannibal capitalism for reasons that I want now to explain briefly. First of all, why cannibalism? It's a word that has several meanings. The most familiar and the most concrete is the ritual eating of human flesh by a human being. And as you know, that meaning is burdened by a very long racist history because the term was implied by a kind of inverted logic to Black Africans who were themselves on the receiving end of Euro-imperial predation. So I have to confess that I take a certain satisfaction in turning the tables and invoking the word cannibalism here as a descriptor for the capitalist class, a group, I believe, that feeds off of everyone else. I'll come back to that. But the term cannibalism also has a more abstract meaning, which captures a deeper truth about our society. The verb to cannibalize means to deprive, this is a dictionary definition, to deprive one facility or enterprise of an essential element of its functioning for the purpose of sustaining or creating another one. That, I'm going to try to show or convince you, is a fair approximation of the relation of capitalism's economy to its non-economic precincts, to the families and communities, to the habitats and ecosystems, to the state capacities and public powers, whose substance its economy consumes as it engorges itself. Now, there's also, finally, a specialized astronomical meaning of cannibalism. A celestial object is said to cannibalize another such object when it incorporates mass from the latter through gravitational attraction. That's quite interesting because I think it's an apt characterization of the process by which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system. And there's finally, is it still up there? No, the Ouroboros depicted on the cover of my book, but now made into something that looks like a cross between a dollar sign or a pound sign, but with all the scales and eating the mouth, eating the tail, and so on. It's an apt, that's the self-cannibalizing serpent that eats its own tail, which I think, again, is a fitting image for a system that is wired to devour the social, political, and natural bases of its own existence, which, sad to say, are also the bases of our existence. In general, then, this cannibal metaphor offers several promising avenues for an analysis of capitalist society. It invites us to see that society as an institutionalized feeding frenzy in which the main course is us. So much for cannibalism. What about capitalism? That term too cries out for some clarification. It's commonly used to name an economic system, one that's based on private property and market exchange, wage labor, and production for profit. But this definition is far too narrow. It obscures rather than discloses the system's true nature. Capitalism, I argue in the book, better designates something larger, a societal order that empowers a profit-driven economy to prey on the extra economic supports it needs to function. And they are, very briefly, I'll expound them more later, wealth expropriated from nature and from subject peoples, multiple forms of care work, chronically undervalued when not wholly disavowed, public goods and public powers, which capital both requires and tries to curtail, the energy and creativity of working people more broadly. None of these things appear on corporate balance sheets, but they are absolutely essential preconditions for the profits and gains that do. They are vital underpinnings of accumulation, and so they too have to be brought into the picture as constitutive components of the capitalist order, not an economy, an institutionalized social order. So, what is this social order like? It's one that authorizes an officially designated economy to pile up monetized value for investors and owners while devouring the non-economized wealth of everyone else. Serving that, sorry, I'm really running wild with the cannibal metaphors, but serving up that wealth on a platter to the corporate classes, this society invites them to make a meal of our creative capacities and of the earth that sustains us with no obligation to replenish what they consume or to repair what they damage. Now that clearly is a recipe for trouble. That is like the Ouroboros that eats its own tail. It's a society primed to devour its own substance. That's actually a phrase that you might put you in mind of Karl Polanyi, the other very important Karl in my thought. I've got two. Consuming its own substance. It's a veritable dynamo of self-destabilization, which periodically precipitates crises while routinely eating away at the bases of our existence. Cannibal capitalism, then, we put the two words together, I'm claiming is the system to which we owe the present crisis. Truth be told, this is a very rare type of crisis. It's not sectoral. It's what historians, at least of the 17th century, would call a general crisis. Adam Tooze, by the way, this is an aside, uses the phrase polycrisis, but he means something quite different because he thinks that it is quite contingent and not connected. And I'm trying to argue that this is connected. This is not a polycrisis, but a general crisis in the historical sense, in which multiple bouts of gluttony, hugely ramped up under neoliberalism in the past 40 years, have converged. Yes, what we face, thanks to decades of financialization, is not only a crisis of rampaging inequality and low-wage precarious work, not merely one of care or social reproduction, not just a crisis of migration and racialized violence, not simply an ecological crisis in which a heating planet disgorges lethal plagues, and certainly not only a political crisis featuring hollowed out infrastructure, ramped up militarism, and a proliferation of strongmen throughout the globe, in fact. No, it's something worse. It's all of that, a general crisis of the entire social order in which all these calamities converge, exacerbating one another, threatening to swallow us whole. My book, Cannibal Capitalism, tries to map this massive tangle of dysfunction and domination expanding our view of capitalism to include the extra economic ingredients of capital's diet. It brings together in a single frame, or it tries to bring together in a single frame, most, if not all, of the oppressions, contradictions, and conflicts of the present conjuncture. In this frame, structural injustice means class exploitation, to be sure, but also gender domination and racial imperial oppression, both non-accidental byproducts of a societal order that subordinates social reproduction to commodity production and that demands racialized expropriation to underwrite profitable exploitation. As I understand it here, likewise, the system's contradiction incline it not only to economic crises, but also, for the reasons I've just said, to crises of care, ecology, and politics, all in full flower today, courtesy of that long spell of corporate binging known as neoliberalism. Now, it's not surprising then that this social order precipitates a broad array and complex mix of social struggles, not just class struggles at the point of production, but also boundary struggles at the system's constitutive joints, where production butts up against social reproduction. The system incites conflicts over care, both public and private, paid and unpaid. Where exploitation crosses expropriation, it foments struggles over race, migration, and empire. Then too, where accumulation hits natural bedrock, cannibal capitalism sparks conflicts over land and energy, flora and fauna, the fate of the earth. Finally, where global markets and mega corporations meet national states and institutions of transnational governments, it provokes struggles over the shape, control, and reach of public power. All of these strands of our present predicament find their place in this attempt at an expanded conception of capitalism that is simultaneously a unitary concept, but internally differentiated. That's the sort of idea. It's one social system, but it's internally differentiated, and the divisions and institutional boundaries are flashpoints of social struggle, boundary struggles. Okay, so that's the general idea of the book. And now I want to raise the question, what do we gain by expanding this thing so enormously? The reason, I think, is that our received understandings focus too single-mindedly on the system's official economy, identifying the core injustice with the exploitation of free-waged workers at the point of production. And they designate the system's defining irrationality as its tendency to precipitate economic crises. Now, these things are not wrong. They're certainly true, but this is an incomplete picture. Capitalist societies do indeed generate class exploitation and economic crises as a function of their structural dynamics, but they also give rise to additional injustices and irrationality, which are equally structural and serious. So this is an attempt to sort of get beyond that old base superstructure idea that the economy is structural and everything else is somehow a secondary epiphenomenal expression. I want to say that these other things are equally structural, even though they fail to appear on the radar of received understandings. These extra economic defects of capitalist society are also very deeply implicated in the present crises, and we cannot possibly interpret the latter correctly and figure out how to overcome it unless we expand our understanding of capitalism to foreground not just the economy, but this is the key point, the relation of the economy to its non-economic, and by the way, we should put all these words in quotes, non-economic conditions of possibility. So I've mentioned, but I'll say a little more about each of the 4 non-economic conditions for the possibility of a capitalist economy that I referred to earlier. The first is a sizable fund of unwaged labor devoted to what feminists call social reproduction. This labor includes housework, the birthing and rearing of children, the care of adults, including wage workers, the elderly, the unemployed, all aimed at the making and sustaining of human beings. These activities of people making, if you like, constitute an indispensable precondition for profit making. Without them, there would be no workers, no labor power, no necessary or surplus labor time, no exploitation, no surplus value, no accumulation of capital, no profit, just to give you a litany of Marxian terms. Yet, capital accords this activity, this social reproductive work, no value, is unconcerned to replenish it, and seeks to avoid paying for it insofar as it can, at least until it has more recently figured out a way to make a nice profit out of it. Now, the second non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy is a large fund of wealth expropriated from subjugated peoples, especially racialized peoples. This wealth includes dependent, unfree, and unwaged or underwaged labor, but also expropriated land, looted mineral and energy deposits, human bodies, bodily organs, children and reproductive capacities, all serving as inputs to capitalist production, for which capital pays little or nothing. Expropriated wealth was an indispensable source of capital stockpiling at the start of capitalism's history, as Marx maintained, but it did not cease with the system's maturation. On the contrary, the capitalist economy relies even now on a continuing stream of free or cheap inputs as a major source of accumulation, alongside and interimbricated with more standard exploitation. Absent such expropriation of subject peoples, the exploitation of free workers would not be anywhere near as profitable. And yet capital disavows its reliance on such wealth and again refuses to pay for its replenishment. A third non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy is a large fund of so-called free gifts and or cheap inputs from non-human nature. These supply the indispensable material substratum of capitalist production, the raw materials that labor transforms, the energy that powers machines, the foodstuffs that power bodies, and such general environmental conditions as arable land, breathable air, potable water, a habitable climate, and the carbon-carrying capacities of the Earth's atmosphere. Absent these natural inputs and general ecological background conditions, so obvious there could be no economic producers or social reproducers, no wealth to expropriate or free labor to exploit, no capital, no capitalists, and yet again, capital treats nature as a source of free or very cheap gifts to which it helps itself but fails to replenish or repair. And now I come to the fourth and last of these non-economic preconditions for a capitalist economy, namely a large fund of public goods supplied by states and other public powers. These include legal orders that guarantee property rights, contracts, and free exchange, repressive forces that ensure order, put down rebellion, manage dissent, and enable expropriation, both within and beyond state territory, a money supply that stores value and enables transactions across broad swaths of time and space, transport and communications infrastructure, about which we just heard quite a bit, and a variety of mechanisms for managing system crises. Absent these public goods, there could be no social order, no trust, no exchange, no sustained accumulation. And yet capital tends to resent public power and seeks to weaken it. I mean, this was written quite well before the current moment, but it seems to have a point, yes. Seeks to weaken it, evading its regulations and the taxes that are necessary to sustain it. So each of the four conditions represents an indispensable presupposition of a capitalist economy. Each harbors social relations, social activities, and forms of social wealth that together form the sine qua non for accumulation. Behind capitalism's official institutions, wage labor, production, exchange, finance, stand their necessary supports and enabling conditions, families, communities, nature, territorial states, political organizations, and civil societies, and not least of all, massive amounts and multiple forms of unwaged and expropriated labor. Fundamentally integral to capitalist society, these things too are constitutive elements of it. Capitalism, I'm concluding, is no mere economy, but something a lot bigger, an institutionalized social order that includes the non-economized zones on which the economy relies. Now, the advantage of this conception is that it allows us to scrutinize something very crucial, which otherwise is hard to even formulate. And that is the relation established in capitalist society between the system's economy and its background conditions. As you can see, I'm claiming that these relations are contradictory and perverse. And this is the sort of Polanyian moment of the argument, right, about economy versus society and nature, because land, labor, money, the fictitious commodities in the Great Transformation. Okay. Economic actors, as we call them, whom the system wires to accumulate capital, have every incentive to drain wealth from the society's non-economic zones while offloading the costs onto others. By definition, then, cannibal is capital, primed to guzzle its own conditions of possibility. And necessarily, too, it generates multiple injustices and irrationalities beyond the economic. Deeply implicated in the present crisis, but invisible to received understandings, these appear with blazing clarity when we assume this expanded view of what capitalism is. We get, first of all, an expanded catalog of capitalist injustices beyond the received focus on class exploitation, as I already noted, whereas that injustice resides, if you like, within the capital, within the system's economy, the capital-labor relation itself. Others are grounded instead in the divisions between the economy and its non-economic. It's the Marxian plus the Polanyian, if you get it. The division between economic production, where labor is remunerated in cash wages, and social reproduction, where it is often unwaged or underwage, sentimentalized, and recompensed in love, is a case in point. And of course, that's a historically gendered distinction, which I would argue grounds the form of modern male domination and subordination of women in a capitalist economy. And it also has a lot to do with gender binarism and heteronormativity. Second, capitalist societies institute a structural division between free workers who can exchange their labor power for the cost of their reproduction and dependent others whose persons and assets can simply be seized, unable to access rights protection or the full costs of their own reproduction. The latter group provides capital with a steady stream of free or cheap inputs that swell the tide of profit. This is a status division between the merely exploitable and the downright expropriable. And it's a fundamental structural division within, you could say, the working class of capitalist society. Coinciding roughly but unmistakably with what Du Bois called the global color line, it undergirds a range of structural injustices, including racial oppression, imperialism, old and new, indigenous dispossession, and genocide. Then two, capitalist societies institute a sharp division between human beings and non-human nature, which cease to belong to the same ontological universe. Reduced to a tap and a sink, non-human nature is open to brute extractivism and instrumentalization. Now, some people might say this is an injustice against nature or against non-human animals. That may be true, but whether you believe that or not, it is at the very least an injustice against existing and future generations of human beings who are left with an increasingly uninhabitable planet. Finally, capitalism institutes a structural division between the economic and the political. On one side stands the private power of capital to organize production using only supposedly the lash of hunger and need. On the other side, the public power of the state, which is supposed to have a monopoly on legitimate violence and represent law. The effect of that division is to truncate the scope of the political, expelling from the public agenda a range of life and death questions, such as who shall have access to vital life-saving healthcare and who shall not, and many others. Devolving these matters to capital, capitalist societies offer only a poor and shrunken facsimile of democracy, subjecting supposedly self-governing citizens to capital's arbitrary rule. They are veritable cauldrons of political injustice. So this expanded view gives you a much bigger list of injustices. Also, irrationalities, because as I said, what counts as crisis becomes much bigger. We now see that capitalism harbors a structural tendency to crises of social reproduction, insofar as capital tries to disavow the unwaged care work on which it depends. It periodically puts enormous pressure on the chief providers of that work, families, communities, and above all, women. The current financialized form of capitalist society is generating just such a crisis today, as it demands simultaneously both retrenchment of public provision of social services and vastly increased hours of waged work, often low-waged work, per households, including from women. That's a perfect storm of social reproductive crisis. The expanded view also discloses an inherent tendency to ecological crisis. As we saw, capital works overtime to avoid paying anything close to the true replacement costs of the inputs it takes from non-human nature, depleting the soil and befouling the seas. The system floods carbon sinks and overwhelms the carbon carrying capacity of the planet, helping itself to all of those things while disavowing their repair and replacement costs. This system periodically destabilizes the metabolic interaction between the human and non-human components of nature, and we don't have to belabor how serious that has become today. Now, all of those ecological and social reproductive crisis tendencies are inseparable from the system's constitutive reliance on expropriated worth from racialized people, its reliance on stolen lands, coerced labor, looted minerals, its dependence on racialized zones as dumping grounds for toxic waste and as suppliers of underpaid care work, increasingly organized in global care chains. The result is an entwining of economic, ecological, and social crisis with imperialism and racial ethnic antagonism. Neoliberalism has upped the ante here as well. And finally, the enlarged view discloses a deep-seated tendency to political crisis. Here too, capital tries to have it both ways, living off public goods for which it tries not to pay. It's primed to evade taxes and to weaken state regulatory capacities, to take a chainsaw, dare I say. It tends to hollow out the very powers then on which it itself depends. The current financialized form of capitalism takes this game to a whole new level. Mega corporations outgun territorially tethered public powers, while global finance disciplines states, making a mockery of elections and preventing any rulers who might want to, and maybe they're not so many, from addressing popular claims. The result is a major crisis of governance, which is now joined to a crisis of hegemony, as masses of people across the globe defect from established political parties and common sense. So we have many, many crises here beyond the economic. Now, how does this account clarify the struggles and wishes of our age? As I say, I think this should be considered a general crisis of a sort. There have probably only been 3 or 4 such crises, the last one being the late 20s, 1930s, in the whole 500 plus year history of capitalism. So if this is one, it's a big deal, right? Where am I? It's very rare, and it has a double face. It's at once, you could say, an objective system crisis where things break down, but it's also a life world crisis. It's lived as a palpable set of sufferings and unhappinesses and miseries and dysfunction of all kinds. And that's what I mean, really, by a crisis of hegemony. That you will recognize as Antonio Gramsci's term, hegemony, for the process by which a ruling class naturalizes its domination by installing the presuppositions of its own worldview as the common sense of society as a whole. The organizational counterpart of hegemony is the hegemonic bloc, also Gramsci, a coalition of social forces that the ruling class assembles and through which it asserts its leadership. And it's very important that it has buy-in and that it woo constituencies into this sort of bloc. Now, if the dominated classes hope to challenge these arrangements, they have to construct a new, more persuasive common sense or a counter-hegemony, and a new and more powerful alliance or counter-hegemonic bloc. Now, we are living, I think, in a hegemonic crisis of exactly the sort that Gramsci was writing about from his fascist prison. And the result is, using another word of his, it's an interregnum, an in-between time when, to quote Gramsci, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Therefore, it's a time, because of that blocked transition to what we don't know, but the block transition then is filled in with, quote unquote, morbid symptoms. Could you think of a better phrase? And that marks the blockage, the block transition from the old to the new. Absent a successor project, a successor vision that could be implemented as a relatively durable new form of social organization, morbid symptoms proliferate. Political space grows wild. Trumpism is obviously the most obvious of such morbid symptoms, but so I think is what some wits have called TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. That's the obsessive focus on every horrible thing that Trump says or does on the part of many liberals without offering any hint of an alternative, except implicitly suggesting that the alternative is the return to the status quo ante, which generated all of this in the first place. So, where am I? So, the absence of an alternative project. Now, this is what I was thinking when I wrote Cannibal Capital. I thought we need to connect the dots. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of emancipatory engagement or engagement that is potentially emancipatory, as well as plenty that is quite the opposite. But to create a counter-hegemonic bloc requires somehow scaling up and connecting. So I thought, diagnosis, connect the dots, an expanded view of capitalism that shows, right, what the root of all this is. Now, I have to say, though, that the MAGA forces have an absurd diagnosis, totally fallacious diagnosis, to which I'm offering this as a counter. But it is one that actually does seem to work to connect the dots for their growing constituencies. They have actually done, if I can revert to they and we here, they have done what we haven't. They have gone beyond resistance to a counter project. And of course, I don't need to belabor that their diagnosis did not identify the true roots of the crisis and that their project can't overcome them. Well, I used to think that the kind of picture map that I've drawn for you would help people connect the dots and show how there's a common enemy, a common source, and this could produce some more scaled up project. It hasn't happened, and I had to confront the possibility that my thinking here was too intellectualist, that it put too much faith in the cognitive. If you only understood how the system worked, if you saw it in a systemic way, then somehow you would be motivated to change a bit the orientation of your political engagement. Now I have my doubts, and I have begun to think that counter-hegemonic politics may require something more affective. We have a much better diagnosis, back to the we, than MAGA does, but they have something powerful that we lack, an affectively binding political identity. They are the real Americans, or the real Germans, or the real French, or whomever, fill in the blank, the real people. What do we have by contrast? I keep thinking about Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, hegemony. We have a chain of equivalence. Can you really put that up against the real people? I mean, it's kind of weak. It's sad. So I started to think, should we, this is my way anyway, I don't know if it's yours, should we return to political identity, but in a broader way, beyond the more group specific forms that were widely called and even trashed under the expression identity politics? Should we consider the possibility of marching under a broader identity that overarches the differences that identity politics, so-called, was meant to bring out, without obliterating them or ranking them in a hierarchy? Now, I know that when I raise this question, I prompt anxiety, suspicions of Leninism, and that those suspicions will only increase when I tell you that I think that the idea that I'm running with, experimenting with, is to go back to the concept of labor as a central candidate for constructing a political identity, but not labor in what it meant within traditional Marxism, not white guys on assembly lines in factories, but all of those forms of work that I was mentioning at various points. And that includes the public sector, that includes social reproductive work, paid, unpaid, that includes all the forms of unfree or semi-free, coerced, semi-coerced labor, where people don't get even the full cost of their reproduction, if they get anything at all. This is what I'm working on now. I see it as the sequel to Cannibal Capitalism, the thing I forgot about, the affective. And but because I am such a hardcore intellectualist, my way of doing it is to give you another big structural map of why capitalism requires more than one form of labor. And here I am drawing on Du Bois, on that incredible moment in Black Reconstruction, where he says the United States in the 19th century had two labor movements, but they didn't recognize each other as such. And if the abolitionists had united with trade unionists, the whole history of the country, possibly even the world, might have been different. We would have had an abolition democracy instead of a plutocracy. I love this moment, but my feminist hat says, why only two? Isn't there also a third labor movement? If it makes sense to think of abolition, anti-Jim Crow, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, as unrecognized labor movements. I'm not saying that exhausts everything about them, but because of the way I think about racialized expropriated labor, it's as much a state issue as a strict economic issue. Anyway, if it makes sense to think that that's a kind of unrecognized labor movement, why not think that feminism is some kind of an unrecognized labor movement, that its sort of material base, if you like, is social reproduction and the capitalist division, the gendered division in our society between that and commodity production. So what I'm doing now is back to not just all, I'm zeroing in on the labor lens and trying to see how far we could get with that. And it may not capture everything. I'm quite aware of that. But my hunch is that properly understood, a lot more than you think at first sight will be, if not itself reducible to labor, very intimately connected with it. And if that's true, my provocative conclusion is race and gender are not alternatives to class, but structural divisions within it. But we have to think class in a whole different way. That might be something that could go up against, oh, we're the real people. It's been tried before, I grant you, without the results we might have hoped for. But this is a new way of thinking it. It's not a return to your grandfather's idea of class struggle. Thank you very much.
So Nancy has kindly agreed to take a couple of questions. So if we can, if anyone would like to ask a quick question, you are more than welcome. There's a question down there and Laura will bring the mic, but thank you. No, it's not. Not at all.
Okay, great. I was going over there somewhere. Hi, thank you so much for this beautiful talk. And as a legal scholar, thank you for calling out those crucial background rules that law sets that then empower the accumulation of private wealth and property. I want to go back to how you initially were defining the beautiful metaphors of capitalism. And the first one, I think you talked about the ritual, the old definition of the conventional definition of capitalism, of cannibalism as the ritual eating of flesh. And I wanted to invite you to elaborate on the ritual part, because the ritual part suggests to me kind of this intentionality and purposefulness that strikes me as somewhat descriptive of our moment, but there also seems to be kind of a wild kind of sort of almost the opposite of intentional, kind of almost a frenzied feeding as well. So I just wanted to invite you to elaborate a little bit why you added that, to me, crucial modifier of ritual consumption of flesh versus other ways of consuming flesh.
Thank you so much. That's such an interesting question. I would never have thought of it. I don't remember. I probably just copied it from a dictionary. And of course, it would take an anthropologist to really answer this, which I am certainly not. But the only thing I would say is that we're talking here, for the most part, in the realm of racial fantasy, right? So maybe we don't need an anthropologist, but a student of mythology or something, phantasm. But I'm sorry, but I mean, the phantasm, right, is aimed at instituting division. They are not like us. They, eat people. We only eat, cows and horses and fish and so on. So in a sense, that idea, right, it sort of echoes my whole point about, I'm saying, and this really is a kind of materialist, Oliver Cromwell Cox kind of idea, that it's the division between exploitation and expropriation that implants race as a binary, in the same way that it's the division between commodity production, wage labor, and unwaged or underwaged social reproductive labor that implants gender. And that's why I think they're every bit as, you could say they're every bit as structural as class, but since I'm saying they're not like three side-by-side things, but they're all co-constituted in this one system.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This is really, really good, very interesting. I have a couple of questions that are connected to each other. One is that I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about the role of culture and the relationship of culture and labor. And since we're at a university, I'm wondering what you're thinking is, what is the role of the university and what is the role of scholars in contributing to culture that can contribute to a counter-hegemonic politics?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Culture, is absolutely central to this idea of hegemony and counter-hegemony. I only scratch the bare surface, but even in the little that I said, which is about naturalizing the presuppositions of one's worldview as the common sense. So we're talking obviously about mentality, culture, and so on. But even beyond that, I have to say I have Gramsci on the brain. He really thought of the Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, as a counterculture. It wasn't just a political organization in the narrow sense with a set of demands and electoral lists and so on and so forth. It was, a set of, let's go back to ritual festivals and so on and so forth, the community, books, games. I still have a white sweatband for tennis with a red hammer and sickle that I bought at a Humanité festival in Italy, which I thought was incredible. So, there's that sense of culture. In terms of the university, first of all, many, many different things go on in universities. And I would be loath to say that there's one thing that humanities scholars should do. I'm certainly not, you listen to me, do I sound like a traditional learned humanities scholar? No, I sound like some kind of a raving militant. That's not for everybody. And but I draw myself so much on historical work, even though I'm a philosopher, and sociological work and cultural studies and literature and so on. So somehow all of this all of this is permeable in the university, and that's a very good thing. But what I think we do all have to do is figure out, well, many things. I mean, at the university, I guess you can't say this anymore because things have changed so radically, but this used to be this kind of utopian space where, you know, you had tenure, you could say what you wanted, you could write what you wanted, and so on and so forth. And what a privilege to be in this space. That's changed in many ways, from the, you know, very massive use of adjunct non-tenured faculty to a horrendous level of student debt, and to the enclosure of knowledge commons where corporate interests that fund, this is mainly in the natural sciences, research, then, you know, control when it can be published, and if the findings don't, you know, support their product development, quiet. So, you know, there's so much going on at the moment that is threatening. And obviously, we do have to somehow defend against that. But the point of what I'm saying is that defense isn't enough. Isn't there like a football saying the only defense is a good offense, or is it the other way around? I think that's true. I think we're in that moment where that is what I mean. They've gone beyond resistance, and you can't put resistance up against, you know, something that presents itself as a real alternative. So, what would a real alternative be? Well, I think education should be a public good all the way up. I don't think we should be paying for it. I don't think it should have anything to do with profits. I don't think it should rely on the rich to give money, who then now turn around and tell us what our students can do and what we can say about Israel-Palestine. I mean, okay, that's enough. Thank you.
Sometime. Okay. Thank you so much for this really thought-provoking talk, and it was really very rich. I had a question about whether your claim is that capitalism is necessarily and always cannibalistic, or if the particular form of capitalism that we are inhabiting at the moment is distinctively cannibalistic. Yeah. And then in either case, how do you account for the intensification of crisis in the past, whatever, 50 years or however many?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. It's a very central point, and I glossed over it. I didn't really treat it in this lecture. That was a mistake. My view is that what makes capitalism is that in every form, in every phase, it institutes somewhere, somehow, the division between the economic and the political, the division between commodity production and reproduction, the division between expropriated and exploited work, and so on and so forth. So these are it wouldn't be capitalism without those things, but in different forms, those lines are drawn differently. And those lines are always a site of struggle. This is the Polanyi point. People are pushing back. Markets only to here. Don't encroach here. Or the whole battle over state versus corporate power in general, or global finance telling the Greeks that they can't, do what some of them wanted to do for one brief shining moment. Okay, so that this is constitutive. Now, crisis. I'm following Marx in talking about crisis versus crisis tendencies. What I analyzed here are the tendencies for this to happen. But does it all happen to a fever pitch of acuteness all the time? No. And the phases of capitalism's history, as I understand it, and this is where the interregnum idea comes, is that, you know, in each phase, there's some attempt to sort of massage or diffuse these crisis tendencies, which it's like, you know, putting your finger in a dike or something. It works for a while, but, you know, the water comes out somewhere else. So when you get these rare moments of the kind of crisis we have now, then you get this hegemonic void, the morbid symptoms, and then the competition, right? Different projects being proposed and competing and so on and so forth. So you could say that New Deal capitalism, social democratic capitalism was for quite a while, at least for wealthy North Atlantic countries, you know, a good, you know, put it back together somehow for a while. We know about all the exclusions and how it was paid for through automobile production and oil and all the coup d'etats and so on that involved. So it's not a golden age, as some people have said, but it worked for a while. It unraveled, and you know, we need the historians to really tell us exactly how and who did what. These things are not automatic; they're human actions. But anyway, certainly the dismantling of Bretton Woods was a huge issue. Going off the gold standard, you know, the creation of the euro, just in the financial world, this vastly changed the landscape of power at the commanding heights in any case. And so I do think that we have now for 40 years been living through the sort of stealth takeover by this new so-called neoliberal financialized form. And that's what has brought these things to a fever pitch. Now, implicit in your question, and it's absolutely the right question to ask, is could there be a capitalist fix to this? Right? Could what I said, transition to we know not what, a bloc transition, could the transition, if it happens successfully, be another form of capitalism that would solve some of the problems of this one, probably end up like every other one, right? Giving rise to its own problems as these things unravel. And I would say we can't rule that out absolutely, but my money is not on it. For the time frame is very short given the planetary situation. And I don't think the energy sector is going to just roll over and play dead. And so I think there's going to be a big fight. Green New Deal is an interesting attempt to assure workers that they can still have high-paying jobs, so on. But that's one possibility, at least theoretically, is a new form of capitalism. Another is a regression to, you know, people talk about techno-feudalism, warlords of the Musk, you know, tribe and the Zuckerberg tribe and so on and so forth. Another idea is some post-capitalist good alternative, which is the one I'm rooting for, even though I can't spell out exactly what it means at this point. Yeah.
So this next question will be our last question, and then we warmly invite you to stick around to continue this great conversation and eat food and have drinks afterwards. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to invite you to maybe connect your project to Ravens. Because I think like an alternative
Yes.
possibly is to say, actually we did have a counterpublic, and it was a loose coalition of people who told a story about themselves that's about an inclusive society in which we're moving ever forward with progress in terms of rights for a diverse group of people and towards social justice. And so part of what that requires, I think, with your framework is to try to figure out what our media ecology has to say to Gramsci, right? Because counterpublics and some of the frameworks, which really the Frankfurt School was thinking through, is like that is sort of a primary challenge. So in some ways, like following Nussbaum, it's not that rationalism and affect are separate, they are always connected. And so part of what we have to figure out, or what they did figure out, is like, okay, let's make sure we take over all the media that people had said that we lost in terms of soft power in relationship to discourse. So I guess I'm just curious about how a media ecology works in relationship to your framework.
I think it's absolutely central. Thanks very much. And I absolutely saw myself the connection to Raven and her project. Again, I'm working at a level of sort of abstraction, the distance view, but people like Raven and others have a lot to contribute, or I can see what the links might be to what I'm doing. And I mean, I did, the counterpublic idea is, I don't know how to put it. It's a kind of analog to the Gramscian hegemonic field. It comes from Habermas's structural transformation of the public sphere. I developed the idea of the counterpublic because I was very unhappy with his idea that there was just this one bourgeois public, and I was defending feminist counterpublics, Black counterpublics, you name it, indigenous, et cetera, as democratizing, as empowering for people who were shut out or, sort of diminished, let's say, when they sought to participate in larger publics. So it was sort of building a force. The idea, I always thought, was not to self-segregate for its own sake, but to develop interpretations of what was going on, experience, diagnoses, right? And figure out how, but through that empowerment, how to get them even wider circulation. So I still think that that the field, that if you're going to go beyond resistance, you have to link, you have to speak outside your counterpublic. And look, for me, this issue came up within the white feminist movement, and everybody has their own experience of it, I'm sure. I didn't read it, but I had a conclusion. If I had gone further in this lecture, which already went too long, I was going to say that, what was I going to say? I was going to say that it's this point about the defensive and the offensive. I think we have grown, there's a tendency to grow comfortable in your own zone. And God knows we need sources of comfort. But the times demand that we have a kind of political maturity, I would say, that involves relinquishing defensive postures which have become too comfortable in favor of offensive ones, which I think the times demand. And I don't know exactly how that parses out in terms of counterpublics versus official publics, or, I mean, MAGA was a counterpublic. how did they become, like, if not the public, at least, one of the two biggies? They were a counterpublic, a very fringe thing. Maybe we could do it.